I'm really excited to be talking with you today, man. Thank you for spending some time with us this afternoon. I was just telling you before we hit record that this is my first interview back after being gone for several months. A lot of the Dad Tired guys know I've been out for the last several months, just working through my own soul journey, and so part of me feels like I feel some nerves as I'm coming back in, but a lot of excitement as I'm sitting down with you today. So anyway, man, I'll just step out of the way. I'd love for you to introduce yourself, tell us who you are and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, well, love being a guest and honored to be the first one back. So thanks for thinking of me. Yeah, I'm Nick Stumbo. My wife and I live just outside of Portland, Oregon. We have four kids, two girls, two boys, 20, 17, 16, 13. So our life is very busy and active. For the last 9 years now, I've been the executive director for Pure Desire Ministries, which is here to provide hope, freedom, and healing from sexual brokenness and betrayal trauma through Jesus Christ. So our ministry emphasizes that in recovery, there's two sides. There's the one who's struggling, and then there's the spouse that's often impacted very deeply by it. And we provide group resources and, when needed, counseling for both the couple and the individual. And it's coming out of our own story. I was a pastor for 15 years, and in the midst of my pastoral career, had to face my addiction to pornography. And while that was probably the most challenging year of our story, it was also the very best, as God used it not only to heal me and our marriage, but then create a new healing pathway in our church. And so that's, why I'm at Pure Desire today, is because it's my story. And so I'm both the director, but I'm also living out that story of healing and recovery.
Man, that's really cool. I Before we dive into all that really good, like deeper stuff, I didn't know you were in Portland. That's right. I lived out there for 12 years before I'm in South Carolina now, but I was in Portland for 12 to 13 years before that.
All right. You've covered both coasts then. That's impressive.
Well, I was trying to get as far away from Portland as I could. It got a little too crazy for me and my family. Um, yeah, I guess maybe we could talk about that offline, but
Yeah, that'd be another podcast.
yeah, yeah. A couple things come to mind as you shared kind of your introduction to your story there. First is you said your addiction to pornography. I think a lot of guys, we're primarily an audience of men who are listening to this. I would say 90+% of those men would say they've struggled with pornography in some shape or form. They would admit to that. I've been in this men's ministry space for the last 10 years. It's not really a secret. Usually when I speak at conferences or we do our Dad Tired conferences, most guys would pretty readily admit, like, yeah, I've struggled with pornography in some way. I think where guys struggle with, what they struggle with is the word addiction that you used. And I think for most of us, we've kind of convinced ourselves, yeah, I'm not really an addict. Like, how did you personally get to the point where you're like, nah, I think I'm actually addicted? And then how does the Pure Desire define addiction versus just, I might look at porn probably more than I should?
Yeah, that's a great question. And jokingly, one of the signs of addiction is believing we don't have an addiction, because very often when we struggle with addictive behaviors, and really in anything, whether it's food, substances, alcohol, sex, pornography, workaholism, there's a layer of minimizing our behavior, rationalizing what we do, and denying that it is a problem. And I really had to have a wake up call in my life. So brief snapshot of my story. I grew up in a wonderful Christian home. My dad's a pastor. We had a very good home experience. There wasn't any of this. Dad was one way in the pulpit, and then he was a monster at home. Like, no, I have a wonderful, loving dad and safe home. But at a friend's house at about 10 years old, I saw adult content for the first time in my life that exploded this world of sexuality that I really at that point knew nothing about. And in that moment, as I saw, nudity and sexual imagery for the first time, I knew there was something about me that desired it, that felt curious and wanted to see more. And because of that, I also felt very shameful, because I believed it was wrong. I shouldn't be watching this. And what's wrong with me that I like it? And because of the environment of our home, we never talked about those things. I had no context in which to go home and tell mom and dad, hey, I saw these things. What do I do with this? How do I make sense of what's happening in my body and my brain? And so, like so many people do when there's early exposure, I just kind of shoved it, kept it secret. And if you think about that becoming kind of the framework of my sexual experience, like I believe it is for so many Christian men, it was both secretive and shameful.
Uh-huh.
So then in high school, I'm in my mid 40s. So in my day, the internet wasn't quite yet what it is now, and so my early access was to pornographic magazines. We would be on late night basketball road trips coming home in Montana. Every road trip was a late night road trip. Get back from a late basketball game, and I could stop by a corner store and buy a magazine, and I would act out to that, and then I would feel just the wave of shame and regret, and okay, Lord, never again. This was the last time, and I'd throw it away. And that pattern would repeat itself every month, maybe every couple of months, maybe every couple of weeks. Um, and then I took that into college where the internet did start to become a thing, and found that I could find those same images for free online and watch them and again act out. But then it'd be that same binge purge kind of cycle of, okay, that was so dumb. I don't need this. I don't want this. Never again, Lord. That was the last time. But I carried that all through college and into marriage and into ministry. And I remember when my wife and I got engaged, we attended a Christian college, and at a chapel service, the speaker said, "Hey, before you get married, you owe it to your future spouse to air your dirty laundry," as they said it. That they should know everything about you, so that when they say "I do," they know what they're saying "I do" too. And that made sense to me. I'm like, hey, that's only fair. I don't want my wife to have any surprises down the road. And so when we went out on a coffee date that night, I really, for the first time with her or another person, kind of opened up the whole closet of, here's what I've been involved in. And she was very shocked. She was pretty naive at that time and surprised. And I remember she said, well, why don't you promise me that you'll never do those things again? And I remember saying, so this is a 21-year-old young guy. I loved the Lord. I loved this woman. Like, she was way out of my league. I knew it. And I wanted to spend my life with her. But I remember saying these words: I want to make you that promise, but I feel like I've made that promise to God and myself many times before, and it has a way of coming back. So I'm going to try really hard, but I don't know if I can make that promise to you. So already then, there was something in me that knew if someone said, never do this again, I didn't know if that was actually possible. And so I took that binge purge struggle into our marriage, and for 10 years, continued to act out occasionally by viewing pornography. So now it'd be online or on a smartphone, delete everything, not keep anything, confess to God, and on occasion confess to my wife, like, hey, it's still happening. But because I told her in engagement, it'd be like, this was in my life before we even met. This isn't about you. It's not about our physical connection. It's just something I'm working on, and it's getting better. I'd always try to tell her why it was getting better and why this would be the last time. And she would do her best to forgive me, to believe me. But after 10 years of that pattern, her belief had faded to the point of my words were meaningless. And I remember she said at one point, she said, Nick, it's not that I hate you, but I hate the way this makes me feel. And because I don't know if it's ever going to change, I don't know if I can stay around for that much pain.
Wow.
And I was really terrified by that, because I could see I was losing her. I could see it in her eyes. I could see it in her words and her emotions. Like, she was starting to shut off parts of her heart to me. But I didn't know what else to do except what I'd been given as the pattern of just create higher guardrails and boundaries. So never be online alone, never watch TV alone, get rid of the smartphone, like guardrail, 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 and just keep me away from the big bad internet. But the truth that I knew was that nothing inside had changed. There was something going on in me that I couldn't figure out why I would end up in those places. And I had this deep fear that I was only a moment away from being in the wrong place with the wrong access and the wrong motives, and I would act out again. And it could literally cost me everything: my marriage, my kids, my ministry. But I didn't know what else to do. And it was in that season of what we call white knuckling it that I'm just like, okay, try not to do anything stupid and ruin everything, that we were at a conference for pastors in my denomination, and they had brought in Dr. Ted Roberts, who was the founder of Pure Desire Ministries. And they offered this plan to help pastors who were struggling. And they said, if it doesn't involve other people, if it doesn't involve any illegal activity, we want to help you get recovery and keep you in ministry. And it was this wonderful offer that, honestly, as I sat there, because I was in what I mentioned earlier, I was in a lot of rationalizing and minimizing my behavior. I looked around, I'm in the middle of this white knuckling phase, believing I'm a relapse away from ruining my marriage. And rather than saying, well, this is for me, I thought, boy, I hope the men who are really struggling are listening to this, because this sounds like a great deal for them.
Mm,
because they were using words like addiction and recovery. It's like, all right, come on. I mean, I struggle once in a while, but is it really that big of a deal? And
right.
and that, I think, is one of the deep ironies also of addiction, is that at the one point we can feel like I am a relapse away from ruining my marriage. And then on the other hand, saying, but is it that big of a deal? It's only once in a while. It's not real, so I'm actively minimizing it just to try to feel okay about myself. And yet sitting in that same room by God's grace that day was my wife. And
Mm,
as she's sitting next to me, she is hearing an answer to 10 years of prayer,
mm,
praying, God, would you show Nick a way to freedom? Because she believed I wanted it. She just didn't believe I knew how to get there.
yeah.
And so, because of that elbow in my ribs, I'm like, oh, well, I guess I'll check out this program they have. And they had, this was the point of where I'm getting to about addiction. They had, our denomination had set up a great neutral step of going and talking to a guy in our denomination that was a counselor type. And they said, hey, go talk to Morris and he will help you discern if you need to go to Pure Desire. So I went and I met with Morris, a guy that I knew and trusted, and I shared my story. And I really spent most of the meeting trying to justify why I didn't need Pure Desire, because I had internet filters and accountability, and I was doing all the things and praying all the prayers. And he said, okay, Nick, let me ask you a couple of questions. And these three questions changed my life. He said, how long has it been a problem? Number one. And at that point, I'm in my early 30s and really started getting into pornographic magazines in my mid-teens. So I said, well, it's been over 15 years at this point. He said, okay, number two, how many times have you tried to stop? And I actually laughed a little because I was like, well, every time was the last time. Literally every time was it. And I was never going to do it again. So I said, if I'm being honest, I've tried to stop hundreds, if not thousands of times.
Mm,
And he said, okay, third question. Is it causing you or people you love significant amounts of pain?
mm,
And that's where it got serious, because I said, yeah, I think if I don't quit, my wife will leave me. And he said, okay, Nick, let's put those three questions together. It's been a problem for a long time. You've tried repeatedly without success to change, even though it's causing you and people you love tremendous pain. And I was like, well, yeah, that's actually a pretty sobering definition of my life right now.
yeah,
And
yeah.
that's when he looked at me in sincerity and love and said, Nick, that's the clinical definition of an addiction.
Mm,
And I remember in that meeting, I physically sat back
mm,
like he had just slapped me or something, because it felt so unfair. I'm like, I'm a pastor. I love Jesus. I'm sincere about my faith. I'm not living a double life. I'm not trying to hide these things. I mean, by that point, I was actively confessing to my wife, to an accountability partner. I'd been honest with the senior pastor who hired me. I'd been honest with a like, I was being as honest as I knew how. And I'm like, I, I'm doing everything I can. What do you mean addict? Because to me, addiction was a category of people that I didn't belong in.
mm,
But that day, the awareness of an addiction became a definition of the severity of what I was struggling with.
mm,
Because if I had been able to quit on my own, I could have. And it didn't in any way remove the responsibility. It didn't mean like, oh, I have an addiction, I can't help it. It was like, no, the choices I've made have led me to a place where it is now outside of my control to stop on my own. I need more help. And it was with that encouragement that we started in on the 1 year counseling process that Pure Desire has, and doing groups for myself as the struggler and for my wife as the betrayed spouse. And it was because of that awareness that I don't know what I don't know, that we actually finally started to get help and learned there was a whole lot more going on in my brain, in my patterns of behavior, things from my past that were really driving the behavior. I like to say I knew what I did. I didn't know why. I
yeah.
didn't know what was driving that, what had really become an addiction. So, to your question, I think most of us feel like, it's, is it that big of a deal? I'm not going out and paying for sex, or I'm not doing the more extreme things. We like to define addiction based on the severity or the frequency of the behavior.
Mm,
But I think a better indication is it something we've started to depend on and has become ritualistic in our life? Because even if it's only happening, let's say you're relapsing with pornography a couple of times a year, but it's a pretty predictable pattern, there's a reason for that.
yeah.
We would, if a guy came to us and said, hey, I'm doing meth, but it's only a couple times a year. I only do it at home. No one's being hurt, but it's not that big of a deal, right? We would all say like, dude, no, like meth could kill you.
Yeah.
You don't want any meth in your life.
Right.
And if someone was saying, I don't want to do it, but I do a couple times a year, we'd say, you need some support. You need help.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason, when it comes to pornography and that whole world, we've learned to justify and rationalize to the point of saying, well, I don't really need help. But maybe if we asked ourselves those same three questions, we'd realize there's more going on here than I want to admit. But if that's the truth, I need to face that truth and I need to pursue help in whatever form it looks like.
Mm. How much of that cycle going back, you would get the magazines on the way home from the basketball games. How much of that was like what they would call an intimacy disorder, in the sense that you would uh, you've started to now feel shame about what you're doing, and so now you can't get close to the people you love, your parents who sounded like they were great parents, or your friends, or anyone else around you, and so because of that shame that you're feeling, because of the behavior, you actually go back to the behavior because it's soothing. It's become your soothing mechanism, and so and it just creates this vicious cycle of I can't get close to you. I can't really reveal myself because I've got this shameful part of my life. And so because I feel all this pain from the shameful part of my life, I'm going to go soothe. And now my soothing behavior actually makes me feel even worse. And you just get deeper and deeper into that rut.
Yeah.
Like, how much of it is that, where you're now like deeply disconnected from people you love because of that shame?
That's a great question. And I think there are a lot of layers to what was happening there. I mean, at a base layer, acting out to pornography is at a brain level as powerful a reward as doing cocaine.
Yeah.
And in that nature, it is addictive because the substance is different, but what it's doing to the brain is on par with drugs. And so there is a part of your brain that God designed. God designed our brain to seek out pleasure and to avoid pain. And that reward center of our brain remembers, like, wow, that feels amazing. I want it again. And if we've not really constructed any change, the brain remembers that pathway. And so part of it is the cues of, oh, it's late at night. No one knows where I am really. I could stop and buy one. I remember what that felt like last time. And your brain starts to go down that pathway before you've even stepped into the store. One of the things we're learning about dopamine is that it's as much an anticipation of pleasure chemical
Yeah.
as it is a pleasure chemical. And dopamine starts to be released the moment you think about the old behavior,
Yeah.
so that you're more likely to pursue the pleasurable activity. Now, in a perfect world, in God's kingdom, you could see how beautiful that would be, that we remember the joy of relationship. We remember the joy of eating a meal with people that love us. And we want to keep repeating those behaviors, but it so easily can be hijacked for sinful and destructive purposes. So on that level, there's a lot happening on the brain. But that is what you're bringing up. What I was completely blind to is how much in that whole sports career I was wrapped up in a performance-based way of living. And also the ways it connected to my family of origin. So my dad, as a wonderful man as he is, he was an all-state high school athlete. And yet he would tell me about in his story that his dad, who was also a pastor, and in the 50s and 60s, high school sports compared to building the church, well, the church was what it was about. And he says, my dad never came to any of my games. Well, my dad came to all of my stuff. Like, my dad was my number one fan, and he was there to support me. But also there was a lot of needs that were growing in me to feel like I was good enough for my dad. And I was on the basketball team, but I was often on the bench and I struggled for playing time. And I never felt like I could quite achieve what I thought I was capable of and what my dad believed I was capable of. And so there was this growing voice that would say, you don't have what it takes. You're not good enough. And then I'm watching the guys that are the starters and they are the stars, and they're all, you hear the stories of them being much more sexually active. And so I would retreat to this world of pornography. But what I was blind to is how all of the things I was longing for on the basketball court and in life that says you're wanted, you're good enough, you have what it takes, I was finding in a very artificial way in pornography.
Right.
Because in that fantasy world, you're good enough, you have what it takes, you're wanted, you're desired. And then there's this rush of chemicals that says, man, this is amazing.
Right.
And for those few moments, everything you're looking for gets found, but it's a complete lie. Because then after that, what you bring up, the shame cycle kicks in. You go back to your real world and you're like, well, I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. Oh, and now, by the way, I have a behavior that I don't want to tell people about because it would only affirm that I'm not good enough and I don't have what it takes and I'm actually a failure. And so I need to hide this And in that hiding, I'm reinforcing the very voices that are driving me to it. And so we do talk about it being a shame cycle, and a cycle that doesn't just keep you stagnant, it's actually spiraling downward, because the more you use, the more you reinforce the negative messaging, the greater the secrets you have that you're keeping from people. And now you're trapped in this place. But the real devious nature of it, going back to the dopamine hit, in a weird dysfunctional way, it works.
Right.
And that's one of the things I try to say to men of why you stay stuck, because there's something about it that works. There's a payoff, there's a pleasure chemical, there's a system of hiding that is, you've made it work to construct your life around. But you can see, if you're able to take a step back and be honest, you can see it's only working in the moment, but it's actually leading me on a path of destruction.
Right.
And to me, that's John 10:10 lived out in our real world, that the enemy comes to steal, kill, and destroy. He still steals our hope, he kills our dreams, and he destroys our future and our families. But it doesn't happen all at once. It's happening progressively as a pathway we're being led down. But in recovery, Jesus has come that we might have life, and have life to the full. And that's really what we're all about at Pure Desire.
Mm. You bring up an interesting point about, what you were longing for in sports that you were finding in pornography. Because I think a lot of guys, again, I've spent a lot of time with guys, and I think I've heard a lot of guys say, this is just it's something I do because I'm bored. It's something I do just it relaxes me. I've had a stressful day and I'm just trying to relax before I go to bed or whatever. But you were tying in the point you were making about what you were longing for in basketball, you were finding in pornography. That's not like a boredom issue. That's not you're just trying to relax. You're finding soul needs in pornography. And I think the one thing that's
Yeah.
fascinating is if guys were to slow down long enough and be introspective long enough, that they would ask themselves, or try to make connections between even the type of pornography that they're looking at and how that specific type of pornography is trying to meet, like you said, artificially, a much deeper need. And it really can be connected oftentimes back to, here's what I'm longing for in my life. I'm longing to feel powerful or valued or worthy or whatever. And then you don't find that for whatever reason in your real world. And so you go to even certain genres of pornography in order that you would get those emotional needs met, which I think is evidence that this is not a boredom issue or I'm trying to relax, but this is like, there's some deep psychological, emotional, spiritual issues happening here at a deeper level.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
We talk a lot at Pure Desire that pornography is a coping mechanism. And when I say coping mechanism, I want to be clear that that's not a negative thing, because in truth, we all need methods of coping with the unpleasantness of life, with difficult emotions, with hard situations, with pain. Like, what do we do to cope? And in an ideal world, we would cope by going to relationships, by leaning into people that care, by pursuing healthy activities. But so many of us have learned in addictive type behaviors, again, whether we're talking food, drugs, alcohol, pornography, that there's something I can go to that makes me feel something good, and that anesthetizes, or it numbs the pain I'm feeling.
Yeah.
So to go to the feeling of boredom, I discovered in my life this pattern that as a teenage kid, when the house was empty and I'm bored and I have nothing to do, I would remember, in our home, it was the Sears catalog. And there's a section in there of lingerie. And like when I'm bored and lonely, boy, did that fill up the time. And there's all these pleasure chemicals that are going off in my brain. Well, when I'm now 20 years down the road, if I haven't learned any differently, when I'm feeling alone and bored and don't feel very motivated, what does my brain do? My brain remembers a pattern that says, oh, we know a really effective strategy to cope with these feelings. And so I think you're spot on that when you're talking about this pattern, particularly if we would say at a moral level, I object with what I'm doing, that morally, I believe men and women are created in the image of God, and any person I see, I'm seeing an image bearer, and I want to treat them as a human being of dignity, value, and worth. And so if I'm objectifying them and turning them into something for my own pleasure, I'm violating my own moral code. So if someone is in that place as a Christian, or that's their worldview, and they choose that behavior, that's where I would say, you need to take a step back and say, what is it about this behavior that I would morally object to on so many levels, But in these circumstances, I normalize it and treat it as not a big deal. Again, going back to my illustration of if a friend came and said, "Well, I only use meth a couple of times," it's no big deal, right? We would say, I think there's a problem here that's your go-to. So if our go-to, and that's what I had to realize, like, yeah, I remember saying to Dr. Ted Roberts in my counseling, I'm like, I don't think I have an addiction. I think I just like attractive women, and who doesn't? And he pointed out, he said, Nick, it probably started that way because there are normal human hormones and desires, and God created us with the capacity for lust and seeing sexual images and being turned on. Like, all that's God's creation. He said, but somewhere in that, it got fused into your response to how you do life. That now when you're bored or when you're overwhelmed or when you feel depleted or when you feel uncertain of what to do next, pornography has become the way to feel all the stuff you want to feel. And the more you can unravel that system, you'll see that pornography doesn't have to be your go-to anymore, because you'll develop healthier ways of coping with life and those unpleasant emotions and strong desires. Like, there are better ways, and we can learn to walk in those ways. So yeah, I think anytime we're engaging in a behavior that we'd say at a moral level, I object to it, but I keep doing it, there's something deeper going on. And it's worth finding out what is that deeper question.
Yeah. I think it might be discouraging for some guys to hear your story and think you were confessing to your wife, which for a lot of guys is like, that's unimaginable. You were confessing to the other pastors at the church. You had filters and roadblocks, and you still couldn't overcome it. That's like, it's like, dang, man, you were doing all the things that I would imagine I would do if I were trying to stop. I imagine a lot of guys are saying that. What did you learn once you got into the Pure Desire program that was like, that took you beyond the white knuckling? Like, what did you hit? What were some of the light bulb moments where you're like, I'm hitting the why, not just the what I'm doing, but the why that got you past just white knuckling it and having all these, you know, roadblocks, but just like started to find real healing.
One of the mistakes we make is believing that confession is the goal.
Hmm.
If I just get real, if I just get it out there, then I'll be free of it. But the truth is, confessing for me, and I've seen for a lot of people, can actually become part of the system of binge purge.
Hmm.
That it really is just the purge of, okay, I get it all out there. I, in a sense, emotionally vomit this terrible stuff I'm doing, but wow, now I feel better. But none of the deeper stuff has been addressed. Nothing has actually changed. And that's why I think biblically, the concept we see more than just confession is repentance. And repentance isn't, I feel really sorry about something and I confess it. Repentance is that metanoia. It's a change of behavior. It's turning and going in a different direction.
Yeah.
Only the problem with our struggles with pornography or lust or compulsive sexual behavior is most of us don't actually know how to go in a different direction, other than to just try harder not to do the bad thing.
Right.
And so that's what the Pure Desire group, I think, created some revelation of, like, oh, confession, because I would underscore, it is important. That's in a weekly group setting. In a sense, we're coming and confessing. And that's James chapter 5. The word there for confess your sins is actually in the Greek. It's an ongoing action verb that should be translated, in my opinion, should be translated confessing. This idea of ongoing, living in the light, living in the truth, telling the reality of my story, and then getting help to go in a new direction. So like in the Pure Desire group, for me, it was unpacking the pattern that I would go through when I would act out in pornography and realizing that it was incredibly predictable.
Yeah.
So to give a quick example of that, when I would feel a little overwhelmed by my work as a pastor, or like there was a project in front of me that I didn't feel good about, I would start to procrastinate. Procrastinate would be step one. And in that procrastination, in those days, I would be doing a lot of fantasy sports and, looking up player stats and matchups and looking to trade. Well, now I'm wasting time online. So that's step two. And in wasting time online, inevitably, as our world would have it, you're going to come across something sexually triggering. Maybe it's a banner ad, maybe it's an article, clickbait, maybe it's a pop-up. And typically in my past, that'd be step three, something sexually triggering. Typically, I would respond really well to that. Turn it off. I don't want to see that. Go to a different website. But that thought and that image would sit with me. And as I would stay in this place of procrastinating and not feeling good enough, eventually I would come back and click on something or look a little more. And now I'm crossing one boundary that at that point it's like, is this a big deal? Well, probably not. But that's not where it would stop. It would now lead to more wasted time online, more viewing until I'm in a binge. And now I'm viewing pornography and I'm acting out and I'm feeling terrible, which would be the next part. Okay, now I get rid of everything. I start over. I start fresh, never again. Well, I'd been cycling in and out of that pattern for 15 years and never knew it.
Mm.
And one of the powerful things then that we teach and that someone will learn in a pure desire group, we think of integrity as men to be this idea that if I was on a computer alone late at night, feeling triggered to look at pornography, I would just shut down my computer and walk away. That's integrity. And what I figured out is that integrity is more about having the wisdom to know that I should never be alone late at night on a computer where I could become triggered.
Yeah.
That success was found at the beginning of the pathway, not trying to fight to avoid relapse at the end of the pathway. It's the idea of a train that as a locomotive picks up steam, there is energy and momentum behind it. And as everyone knows, for a train to stop might be a mile long of braking.
Yeah.
That's kind of what's happening in your brain and your body. The more dopamine's kicking in and you're being triggered until like it's a train picking up speed. And again, we're still responsible for the choices we make, but what it says is that's a lose situation. You are now battling your own chemistry and your God designed systems of reward in your brain. The better strategy is to figure out what makes that train first start moving. And as soon as it starts moving, and usually those are non-sexual things like
Right.
loneliness, boredom, procrastination, anger, frustration, a feeling of disrespect from a spouse, not feeling good, and all of those become this little engine that starts to say, I'm unhappy with something.
Yeah.
And if that pathway over and over in your life has led you to pornography, and you don't deal with the first step, the loneliness, the procrastination, the boredom, it's going to keep taking you to that same place. And that for me was so eye-opening of like, oh, I'm not actually learning strategies of just how to avoid pornography online. I'm actually learning what starts that whole process in my life: procrastination, boredom, not feeling good enough. And when that begins to develop better strategies of how to take that to God and others in a way that really is healing and restoring rather than just being a way to numb out and avoid feeling what I'm feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of like the halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, so, and you named
Exactly. Yeah.
more of those, but yeah, some of what you're feeling that you're vulnerable under those circumstances. It also reminds me of like the, outer circle, middle circle, inner circle kind of behaviors, what you're talking about. For me personally, I'm going to give you two examples of what I would call, uh, middle circle behaviors. That would lead that I would know the train has started to go down the path. One of them, and these sound weird. I'm purposely throwing two weird ones out so that guys can kind of put flesh to what you're talking about. One of them is Zillow for me. If I'm on browsing on Zillow, and the reason that's a middle circle behavior for me, circle being yellow light, like you have started
Right.
the path, the train
We're
has
getting in the danger
yeah,
zone.
we're getting into danger zone. And the reason Zillow, which feels so harmless, is for me, I'm starting to check out mentally. There is zero reason for me to look for houses right now. We have a perfectly fine house.
Yeah.
We live in a great neighborhood with great neighbors. My kids are, and everything's fine. So if I'm starting to like get to a spot where it's like, well, what about houses in Tennessee? Well, what about houses over here? Well, what if we lived closer to some water? If I'm starting to get into that thinking, that is indicating to me something is happening deeper at a soul level. I am looking to escape in some way, from whatever the reality is. So for a guy that's like, I've told some of my guys from our garage group that, some of my pastors, like, I have Zillow in my middle circle, and they were just so baffled by that. But for me, I really know what's happening, and it is an escape. It's kind of, my brain is moving, it's checking out, it's going to some fantasy, not even sexually, just fantasy of like,
Right.
what else could be out there that would satisfy my soul. The other one I have on my middle circle, which is, comical and slightly embarrassing, is Oreos. If I am eating too many Oreo, like if I go to the store and I grab a case of Oreos and I'm just like pounding a sleeve of Oreos, something is going on in my soul. I am soothing some kind of like, I've put the kids to bed, I've grabbed Oreos, and I'm just like pounding them. Something deeper. I know for me
Yep.
personally, I'm not saying Oreos need to be on every guy's thing, but for me personally, I know this is unhealthy behavior for me. Something at my soul level is off. And so this sounds so silly, but I've literally limited myself to three, or like if I'm going to have Oreos, I get three of them. And part of that is, again, just recognizing the patterns within myself that would start that train to roll down. Um,
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, you're defining in your life what leads towards health and what leads towards unhealth. And
yeah,
that I think of it, it's kind of like the dials on the cockpit of an airplane
yeah,
that all those lights and warning signals are not in and of themselves the problem, but they start to alert you that there may be a problem somewhere else in the plane.
right.
And for guys, it's asking that question of like, why is this? And emotions are such an indicator, like anger.
Hmm.
And we might say, well, why did you get angry? It's like, well, because my kid was annoying me. Well, but if I'm honest, I know that my kid doesn't always annoy me. And sometimes I'm really gracious when they ask me that question. And sometimes I see it as a teachable moment. But in that moment, I
Yep.
got angry. And to actually be able to pause and say, why did I get angry? And we realize that in my spirit, what I felt in that moment, their question actually made me feel not good enough as a dad. And I felt
Mhm.
weak. And I responded to that feeling of weakness with anger because that's how I've learned to deal with anger or weakness is to get angry.
Yeah.
And that can become part of a pattern then that my anger leads to regret and shame. And now I isolate. And in isolating because I've made people mad, I'm now I start to find a trigger towards sexual activity
Yep.
because in my brain it's all become connected. But
Yep.
maybe the starting point was feeling the emotion of weakness. And as men, that's one of the challenges. Like in this world, we're gonna have times we feel weak
Yeah.
or afraid or alone. And those aren't things typically we're allowed to express as men in a lot of environments. And so we've learned unhealthy ways to cope with those emotions that really they're just warning lights trying to say, okay, there's something going on here. Because if my trigger is, weakness or failure, I can probably trace it back in my story to somewhere that got lodged in my thinking that said, if I'm weak, I'm not loved. Or
Yep.
if I'm weak, I'll be rejected. And there's a story there from my family or my dad or a coach. And I'm still actually trying to rewrite that story, but I'm doing it in really negative ways. And that, again, is the power of a group environment like Pure Desire and the kind of work we do is you're going to piece together your whole story in ways you never have. I've told people that for me, when I did counseling with Pure Desire, I didn't learn anything new about my life. What I did learn was all these connections that I never knew existed. I
Yeah.
mean, I know I had a performance streak. I knew I wanted to be the best, but I had never put together how deeply that was woven into my story and how actively that was driving behaviors like using pornography. And so you've got a story. If you're breathing, you've got a story. The question is if you understand the way your story connects and leads you into unhealthy, sinful behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. We've worked with a counselor over the last few months who often uses the phrase, you got to collect the dots to connect the dots, or
Mm.
the dots, it's like collect, connect, and correct. Counselors always have all these pithy statements like that, but I think you're right. It's just like,
Yeah.
okay, what are all these things that have happened in my life? How do we put them together? And then how do we correct it? Um, one of the things you talked about was confession and that not being the full piece of the story, which I thought was really helpful for you to share that. I think a lot of guys might hear this, or I wonder if there's guys who are hearing this who feel like even as they're listening, they know they've got some deep secrets and they're like, they might feel a sense of like deep guilt and they just have to kind of purge it out on someone, or maybe like you did when you were in college before you got married and it was like, I just need to confess everything to my fiance, or some guy feels like I just need to go home tonight and tell my wife everything. Um, what would you say to that? Could that be harmful? Is that the right thing to listen to a podcast like this? Guys are feeling kind of all kinds of guilt and shame and just go home and kind of dump all this stuff. Is that right? Is that wrong? Is that helpful? Is that not helpful? What would you say to guys who are feeling that?
The desire to be honest and the desire to be fully known by people that love us is a good desire, but we can go about it in the wrong way. I used a phrase earlier that might have stood out to some of it's a little bit like emotional vomiting.
Uh-huh.
And the problem is, man, I feel so much better, but everybody else has to clean up the mess.
Yeah.
And they may not have the tools or support or resources to deal with that mess. And what we find so often, those are very much cleaned up confessions, if I can put it that way. We share just enough to feel like we're being truthful, but we haven't actually shared the full reality. And so what happens is the follow-up questions come and then there's more. Or the next day there's the, oh yeah, I forgot about, and there's more and there's more. And the wounding it can have to a spouse, they have discovered through a lot of research can create the same emotional profile as a rape victim.
Mm.
I know that's really extreme for guys to hear. It's like, holy cow, that, I mean, that is a way different thing. Sure, the behavior is, but in terms of the trauma it can create, it is on that level.
Yeah.
And so what we really try to coach men is to say, confession is good, but let's start with another guy, or let's start with a group. Let's start with a place that has been designed to help you work through that confession and do it in a way that then can become full. It's the full truth and an appropriate level of honesty. And what I mean by that is sometimes guys in a desire to be truthful, they start sharing details that are actually not helpful in terms of the kind of woman, the names of movie stars, the names of websites, the kind of fetish. And there are some of those categories that may need to be addressed in a helpful process.
Yeah.
But if we haven't done some of our own work, it's going to come out in ways that will probably create even more pain than we ever intended. And so that's why we encourage, yes, your wife or girlfriend, if you want to have a truly intimate relationship, they need to know everything. But how and when they hear it, if you could do it in a way that has been thought out, I've always said written down,
Uh-huh.
and actually shared with a friend or brother first to say, hey, this is what I'm going to share. Ask me questions that this brings up.
Yeah.
And you can determine where is there too much detail, where is there not enough. So that when I share, one of the things I always say to guys is the worst thing you can do is share with your wife and then realize I didn't share everything,
Yeah.
because it will actually increase the feeling of shame that, well, if she hears this piece, then
Yeah.
it's really going to get bad. And so, yeah, you got to go through that door at some point. But when you walk through it, what we want to do is equip you to have it be the greatest possibility that will be a healing moment and
Yeah.
not just a destructive moment of here's my truth that's going to hurt you. So, our encouragement is get in a group, get with another mentor and a guy and start sharing it, start doing your work, because then you can be equipped to confess in a way that can actually be redemptive.
Yeah.
Now, the other side of it that so many men will experience, they don't get that luxury because they get caught.
Right.
And when you get discovered, some truth's going to come out. But I would encourage you, even there, do your best to try to get some help, get some support, get with another couple that's walked this road, because you are about to face one of the most intense moments of your life that will probably define your future. And if you resort to half truths, to defensiveness, to blaming, or to staggered disclosure, very often that leads to the destruction of a marriage. But if you approach it with a heart of humility, of a desire to change, and that's the other thing I'd say about confession that I saw. I thought confession again was the goal. If I confess, I'll get better. I would say confession needs to be the starting point of action.
Oh.
So my question to you, if you realize, man, there's stuff my wife doesn't know and I'm going to need to tell her, how could that be accompanied by action?
Yeah.
Because it's a totally different ballgame if you confess to your wife and say, and by the way, I've already joined a group. Here's steps I'm taking. I've purchased these workbooks. I've reached out about counseling. Here are the things I'm wanting to do. Will you go on this journey with me? That's very different than, well, here's all my junk and now we're better, right?
Right.
Because I think sometimes that's what guys want. Like, well, if I confess and you forgive me and now we move on, clean slate. And I wish to heaven it worked that way. I wish we got it out and it healed us just by getting it out. But it's a journey of transformation, because as we've talked about, it's all that deeper stuff that's driving us into the behaviors. And so we can confess the behaviors, but that's like the above the waterline part of the iceberg. The
Yeah.
behaviors are just the tip of the iceberg. And you've got to get them out. They've got to be known. But to change, you've got to deal with all the stuff under the water, your desires, your history, your story, your unwanted emotions, understanding your pattern. And that's a work that takes time. And so the more that you can show, I'm committing to do the work of recovery, the more palatable it will make your confession, if I could put it that way.
Yeah.
So your first step should be, boy, how can I start working on my recovery so that when I do confess, it's accompanied by action and not just words?
Yeah, that's really good. I've heard it said that's like, that confession can feel like you took off a 500-pound backpack, but unfortunately you gave it to your wife,
Yep.
and now she's carrying that. And so, yeah, I think you're right that it can cause a significant amount of trauma, and so you want to do it well, and you definitely don't want to do that like trickle truth disclosure where you're just kind of staggering, because it can be, like you said, the research shows that it can be harmful to just continue to drag that out over days, weeks, months. One thing that might be helpful for guys, whether you've recently been caught or you plan on confessing this, whatever your situation is, that you would just make a commitment to your wife to say, "I want to tell you the truth in full. You know, I'm committed to telling you the complete truth. I just want to do it really well. And so, maybe now's not the time for me to dump all the things on you. Let me think through this and let me get some help and work through this and do it right. Write it down. You know, work through some people who have experience in this. But I am committed to telling you the truth completely." That might be a helpful way to approach it with your wife so that she knows that you are committed to it. You want to tell her the full truth, but you're not going to spend the next month giving her one piece of information at a time, you know,
Yeah,
per her
very
question.
good.
So, man, this was really helpful. I know you've got some book. You've talked about Pure Desire, which I know we'll put a link in the website so guys can check out that resource. You've got some books too, right? You know, tell us other ways that guys can get connected or get some resources on this issue.
Yeah, find us at puredesire.org. We have all kinds of free tools, books you can purchase. We have a weekly podcast. If there's a part of recovery you're wondering about, you could probably type it in the search bar, and we probably have done a recovery on it, because our goal is to have conversations about sexuality that nobody's having and to equip you to experience change and transformation in your life. And so that's all at puredesire.org. I wrote my story in a book called Setting Us Free. And you can find that Setting Us Free at our web store at puredesire.org or on Amazon or any place they sell books. And a great starting point, you know, for men, we have 7 Pillars of Freedom as our men's group. And for wives who are experiencing that pain of betrayal, we have groups called Betrayal and Beyond. And I would highly recommend, whether you find a local group around you that is walking through this or join one of our online groups. If in listening to this podcast, there's a party that's saying, man, they're telling my story, joining a group is the single greatest piece of advice I could give to anybody listening, because you can read all the books in the world and listen to all the podcasts in the world, but until you engage in this recovery with other men or other women who are walking that same road and you learn to be completely honest with them, until then, your recovery on your own just isn't going to get it done. And so finding a group is such a key strategy, and you could find those groups on our website as well.
That's awesome. Before I let you go, something you just said there triggered another question I had, which is we do have some wives who listen into the show. They sneak in here and try to hear what the guys are talking about. Um, I imagine some of the wives are probably thinking, "Oh, geez, does my husband struggle with this?" And maybe they would feel the temptation to just, you know, close this podcast and send their husband a text or, you know, hit them, blindside them tonight as they're about to fall asleep. You know, are you a porn addict? Are you, what advice would you give to wives who are listening right now and who don't know where their husband's at?
Yeah. I would just affirm them that it's a fair and right desire to want to know, is this in our relationship? Is this impacting the way he views me? What's going on that I don't know?
Uh-huh.
And I think approaching it in a way that is both gracious and truthful, and at a time where you have some space to talk. And I would say for that wife, you know, to approach and say, hey, I heard this podcast and I realize it's a part of our relationship I don't know that we've ever truly sat and been honest about. And I want you to know that I love you. And I want you to know that if this is in your life, I want to be a part of seeing it gone. But I also want you to know it's not okay if this is happening. And so, could we talk about what is your truth? What's the reality? And being ready to, for yourself, get help, because I think some people, on men or women, will hear this podcast. This is hard work.
Uh-huh.
It is the kind of thing that a part of us just wants to shut the computer down and go like, okay, I don't want to think about that.
Yep.
But that doesn't change if that's our reality. And so it's a scary place to be. And I would say for you, if you're going to be asking that question, you need the same support. You need to know, who can I go to that will be a healthy sounding board and not just be girlfriends be like, man, dump him, get rid of him. He's looking at porn, kick him out. Like, because there's attitudes out there like that, that if your desire is to work through this, there's support that you can have through group, through mentors, through counselors that could really help you walk a pathway to know, what do you need to know? How do you reestablish trust? How do you create healthy boundaries in the marriage? How do you have an action plan if there's a relapse? Like, all those things are available to you as the spouse. And you could find them at puredesire.org and other places, because as you open that door, knowing that you're not alone, that you have people to go to, is just as important as your husband finding places he can go and get help.
Mm. Thanks, Nick. This was so great, man. I really appreciate it. You've given us a lot of wisdom today, so I appreciate you taking the time to spend with us today. Thank you.
Man, thanks for having me on. Thanks for having the hard conversation. I appreciate it.